Well, moreover, Hume's complaint ignores some concrete data. Not least, he failed to give attention to concrete facts that not all religions equally claim miracles, right? Not all of them do. A lot of the Islamic ideas don't really have miracles per se that things like the Old Testament and the New Testament do. Now, they hitch on the wagon, as Christians hitch on to the Old Testament as well. And so if we cancel those out, then we're left with the New Testament. And with what we have in the Quran and the Hadiths, we don't really see the type of miracle claims there. So here we can't just say, well, there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's Jewish people, and so they all cancel each other out. That's not what's happening. We need to take a look at each miracle in and of themselves and see if they have validity. Well, further, not all miracle claims are equally well attested. For example, those in historical narrative recounting recent events are not comparable in historical value to legends transmitted orally for centuries or surfacing first in generally non-factual genres. It is a logical fallacy to reject stronger claims simply because weaker ones exist. On such grounds, one could dispute most kinds of truth claims since they usually have false or weaker competitors. So, you have Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. If he thanks Apollo and Zeus for letting it happen, well, we know that didn't happen because he's attributing the claims to gods. We know that they don't exist, and so Caesar never crossed the Rubicon. Right? He was disproportionately disadvantaged. He won against Pompey, and we know that couldn't happen because that's just so outside the realm. And he's invoking a deity that he's saying helped him in this endeavor. So we know that didn't happen. No, that's not what we do. We don't do that for things that we kind of all accept in history. So let's not do it for claims that happen in history that we just don't want to deal with because we want to be neutral, or what we really want to do is reject it all.
And he says, most important, Hume's counting the testimonies of different religions against one another indeed is poor logic in any case, right? No court, he tells us, would throw out two testimonies on the alleged allegation that, well, one of them is false, so we have to throw one out, Both of them out, right? One is false, so let's throw both of them out. He says some could be true, right? Some claims could be true, miracle claims, and others false. But the recognition that some miracle claims may be, and in fact are false, does nothing to damage the possibility that some other miracle claims may prove true, right? It's kind of like, let's say that I use this illustration with the students that I teach often. Let's say that we're waiting outside the classroom because the door is locked and I don't have a key to it. We can't see in. And we get into discussion about how many chairs are in the classroom. Right? And somebody says, I think there are 30 chairs. And somebody else says, no, there are 35. And somebody says, no, every class has 40 chairs. And somebody else says, well, this one I think has 42. And somebody walks by hearing our discussion say, wow, they all disagree on how many chairs there are in the classroom. I guess there's no real number of chairs in the classroom. Well, of course we wouldn't say that, right?
Right.
And so, that's the point I think that he's trying to make here. Some could be true, others false, but we don't throw out all of them because of the disagreement, right? That's the issue. And so he goes on to say that his goal here is not to favor a specific possible response to Hume or a combination of response over the others in this matter, but to point out that once potential alternatives are factored in, Hume's argument from compelling religions, he says, is too fragile to bear any weight. It's just not a good argument, Hume. Sorry. Right? We don't throw them all out just because they may disagree with each other.
Right. Exactly. We can attribute the negative effects of killing a peacock to Hera, right? And say, well, I've had just this rough life because I ran over this peacock, and you can take that in the same one as there's a pastor, Dwayne Miller, who he had a voice issue. And he's sitting there and he's preaching, and during his preaching on the sovereignty of God, all of a sudden his voice cracks and then gets better all of a sudden. And it's on audio tape. And he attributes it to a miracle. Combining those two together, it does a disservice to both of them, right? So not taking a look at one and not taking a look at the other and just lumping them together to dismiss them does a disservice to that inductive approach that at least Hume is claiming to try and make. Instead, we kind of looked at that's not the case what he's doing. But so taking those two cases in equal fashion does a disservice to both of them.
By the way, he's already argued we can't trust induction anyway. But anyway, we won't go there. We won't go there.
Exactly. All right. Well, what about disbelief in miracles as a dogmatic assumption? Is that possible, or only religious people able to hold dogmatic assumptions? Well, we'll see here. Well, all these points aside, we must also examine the question of alternative explanations for supernatural claims. As a crazy wacko Christian, I also hold to this as well. We should look at alternative explanations for supernatural claims, as extra normal phenomena need not be construed as divinely or even supernaturally caused simply because those who experience it so interpret it. Scholars working from a variety of all religious and philosophical assumptions may recognize the validity of claims about events, say spontaneous remission of a disease, without necessarily accepting the claimant's interpretation of events, say of divine healing. So again, the example I brought up of the pastor with the voice issue. It seems very interesting that it's happening during the sermon. It's happening at almost the peak of the sermon on God's sovereignty, and then it happens there. But, maybe by some evolutionary factor, it all of a sudden spontaneously brought into this type of remission. But the interpretation and the actual events do operate on two different levels as well. Right. Well, some events offer more compelling evidence for supernatural activity than others, but where one places the bar depends in great measure on one's initial assumptions. It's almost like a recurring factor here.
And so it tells us that views about whether any intelligence exists outside of nature are interpretations, right? Not data. Right. Hence belonging to a different sphere of reasoning than purely empirical scientific expert converge, right? So here, whether or not an intelligence exists outside of nature is an interpretation of the things that we observe. Those are not the things that we observe. He says, put more simply, everyone has presupposition. No duh, right? Everyone has presuppositions. Those who dismiss others' evidence because those offering it have differing presuppositions are being neither charitable nor open-minded, and they short-circuit the possibility of dialogue. So if I just dismiss somebody because they don't align with my presupposition, well, I don't get a chance to talk and maybe improve or, consider their particular issue from their perspective and my own. He says, for instance, if an eyewitness claims that she has witnessed someone raised from the dead, one is free to explore multiple explanations for such claims, but simply to assume, barring other plausible naturalistic explanations, that such claims must be disingenuous, in each case exalts one's presuppositions over the evidence. And of course, that's not scientific, right? We want to look at the evidence.
Right. This is starting to become a common trope, even among, the debate bros, is, if you were shown on the surface of the moon, it spelled out your name, this is God of the Bible, believe in me. Well, what would you assume? Well, it's probably some hallucination. It's probably some trick. Aliens. It could be all sorts of aliens. The one thing that I know is not the case is that it's not the biblical Christian God, because I don't believe in him and I also hate him. So I'm being facetious there, but sometimes shoe and the mirror fits.
An element of truth in a lot of this.
Exactly.